I never expected to notice her that way. She wasn't just my friend's mom anymore. She was the woman whose smile lingered in my thoughts, whose touch stayed on my skin longer than it should. And when she whispered, "I haven't felt this alive in years, until you," I knew nothing between us would ever be the same. The evening didn't feel like anything special at first. I was just dropping by my friend's house, the same way I had done countless times before. The familiar creak of the front steps, the soft glow of the porch light, even the muffled sound of the television inside, it was all routine. But the moment the door opened, and she stood there, something in me shifted ever so slightly. She greeted me warmly, as always. My friend's mom, graceful, composed, the kind of presence that immediately made a room feel calmer. She wasn't dressed up, just a simple blouse and jeans, her hair loosely tied back, but there was an ease in her movements, a kind of natural poise that drew my attention. I caught myself noticing things I hadn't before, the warmth in her eyes, the way her smile felt softer when it lingered on me. Inside, the house carried the comforting smell of dinner that had already been cleared away, with faint traces of spices and fresh bread hanging in the air. My friend was upstairs, finishing something on his computer, which left me alone with her in the living room. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But that night, the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was aware. She asked if I wanted something to drink, and as she handed me a glass of water, her fingertips brushed against mine. It was nothing, an accidental touch, the kind that happens every day, but it jolted me, sharp and sudden, as if my senses had been tuned too tightly. Her hand withdrew quickly, though her eyes flickered to mine for a moment, almost as if she'd felt it too. We sat across from each other, talking about ordinary things. She asked about school, about plans, about the small details of my life that most people usually skim past. But the way she listened, it felt different. Her gaze didn't wander, her attention was whole. There was a steadiness in her presence that made me feel both exposed and strangely comforted. At one point, she laughed, not the polite, surface-level laugh I'd heard 100 times before, but a quieter, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes. And when it faded, her expression softened, as though she hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd laughed like that. In that moment, I noticed her differently. Not as my friend's mother. Not as someone older, wiser, or beyond my reach. But as a woman. A woman whose eyes carried both confidence and something else beneath it, a quiet vulnerability that made her seem achingly human. When my friend finally came down, the spell broke, and the air shifted back to normal. But the feeling stayed with me. That touch, that glance, that fleeting smile, they looped in my mind long after I left the house. For the first time, I couldn't quite see her the way I used to. Something had changed, and though I didn't fully understand it, I knew this was the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. The following week, it happened again. Not planned, not orchestrated, just one of those quiet coincidences that life seems to arrange when it wants to test you. I had stopped by, expecting to meet up with my friend, but he wasn't ready yet. His mom was the one who answered the door. She smiled at me, warm but with a hint of surprise, as if she hadn't expected me either. "Come in, he'll be a while," she said, stepping aside. Her voice carried that calm steadiness I was starting to notice more often, a kind of quiet reassurance, like even the simplest words carried weight when spoken by her. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and I realized she must have been in the middle of her afternoon routine. She offered me a cup, and I accepted, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to linger in her presence. We moved into the kitchen together, sunlight spilling through the curtains, laying warm patterns across the tiled floor. She reached up into a cupboard to grab a mug, and for a moment I caught myself watching the movement of her arm, the way her blouse shifted lightly with it. I shook the thought away, forcing myself to focus instead on the sound of her voice as she asked about my week. We stood side by side as the coffee brewed, and though the space between us was ordinary, just two people in a kitchen, it felt charged. When our arms brushed as we reached for the sugar, either of us moved away right away. The contact was small, almost nothing, yet it lingered in my mind long after. Later, she asked if I could help her with something in the garden while waiting for her son. It was nothing complicated, lifting a bag of soil, steadying a wooden trellis, but it gave us time to talk. And there, surrounded by the soft hum of insects and the smell of damp earth, our conversation drifted beyond small talk. She asked questions that felt personal without being intrusive, about my family, my plans, what I wanted out of life. She listened with such focus that I found myself speaking more honestly than I usually did. Every now and then I caught her watching me with a look I couldn't quite name, part curiosity, part fondness, part something else that stirred in the quiet spaces between words. And when she laughed at one of my clumsy jokes, her hand brushed my arm in a natural, almost unconscious gesture. The warmth of that brief touch sank into my skin, sending a pulse of awareness through me. When my friend finally appeared, apologizing for keeping me waiting, the spell of intimacy dissolved into the ordinary flow of the day. But I left their house carrying something with me, the memory of her nearness, her attention, her laughter. It was all so simple, a shared cup of coffee, a bit of gardening, a hand brushing mine. Yet each moment seemed to echo louder than it should, hinting that beneath the surface of ordinary life, something was quietly growing. Something neither of us had spoken aloud, but both of us had begun to feel. It was late one evening when the moment arrived, one of those nights that seemed quiet enough to hold secrets. My friend had gone out unexpectedly, leaving me in the living room while I waited for him to return. The television hummed in the background, casting soft light across the room, but it wasn't enough to fill the silence. She was there too, seated across from me with a cup of tea cradled between her hands. For the first time, it felt like we were truly alone. No interruptions. No footsteps upstairs. Just the two of us, with the air heavy in its stillness. She asked about my studies, about how I was handling everything, and I gave the usual answers: fine, busy, figuring things out. But when I turned the question back on her, asking how she had been lately, something in her expression shifted. Her smile faltered, softening into something more fragile. There was a pause before she spoke. She swirled the tea in her cup, as if stalling for time, and when her voice finally came, it was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You know, it's strange," she began, her eyes lowered. "When the house is full, I feel like I have everything I need. But when it empties out, when everyone goes their own way, I realize how long it's been since someone really asked me how I'm doing. Really wanted to know." Her words settled into the room like something delicate, something she hadn't meant to release but couldn't hold back anymore. She pressed her lips together, almost as if she regretted letting it slip. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on my knees. "I do want to know," I said softly. And I meant it. More than I could explain. She glanced at me then, and in that look was a vulnerability I'd never seen from her before. Her eyes glistened faintly, though she blinked it away. "It's just been years since I've felt really seen. Everyone assumes I'm fine, that I have it all figured out. But there are days I feel invisible." The honesty in her voice struck something deep in me. This was no longer the confident, composed woman I'd always known at the edges of my life. This was someone bearing a truth she rarely let out into the open. Without thinking, I reached out, resting my hand lightly on her forearm. Her skin was warm beneath my fingertips, and I felt the faintest tremor in her muscles, as if the touch startled her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled, a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. For a moment, we didn't speak. The television continued to flicker, the tea cooled in her hands, but the silence between us wasn't empty. It was charged, layered with everything unsaid. She finally whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know why I'm telling you this." I gave her arm a gentle squeeze. "Maybe because I'm listening." Her eyes met mine again, and for a heartbeat, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't name. Vulnerability had pulled us closer, and though either of us dared, the memory of that conversation stayed with me. Days later, when I stopped by again, I couldn't help but notice how differently I felt walking through the door. It wasn't just my friend's house anymore. It was a place charged with possibility. And she was the reason. That evening, my friend was busy upstairs again, leaving the two of us in the living room. A film played softly on the television, though neither of us paid much attention. She was sitting on one end of the couch, her legs tucked gracefully beneath her, a blanket draped over her lap. I took the other end, trying to act natural, though the air felt heavier than usual, filled with all the unspoken words from before. We made small talk at first. She asked about my week, and I asked about hers. But our voices carried a kind of softness, as though both of us knew there was something waiting beneath the surface. At one point, a quiet lull settled over us. She shifted slightly, turning toward me, her hand resting on the cushion between us. I don't know if she realized it, if it was absent-minded or intentional, but my eyes fell on it, and for a long moment I debated whether to reach for it. The thought alone made my chest tighten. Before I could act, she moved first. Slowly, carefully, her hand slid across the small space and rested lightly on mine. It was such a simple gesture. No words, no explanation. Just her hand on mine. But the moment it happened, the entire room seemed to still. Her skin was soft, warm against my palm. I could feel the faint tremor of her fingers, the unsteadiness in the way she touched me, like someone stepping onto uncertain ground but choosing not to retreat. My heart hammered, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned my hand over and gently covered hers, letting my thumb graze the edge of her knuckles. She drew in a quiet breath. I glanced up at her, and her eyes were already on me. They weren't guarded or distant this time. They were open, searching, carrying all the unspoken truths she hadn't dared to voice. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That touch was its own confession, small, deliberate, but undeniable. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. The glow of the television flickered across her face, catching the delicate lines at the corners of her eyes, the curve of her lips as they parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I shouldn't." But her hand didn't move. She stayed there, holding on. I gave her hand the gentlest squeeze, letting her know without words that I wasn't going anywhere. And though nothing more happened that night, no embrace, no kiss, everything had changed. Because now, for the first time, we had crossed the line between what was accidental and what was intentional. To move further, the unspoken truth was already there, alive in the quiet between us. The memory of that conversation stayed with me. Days later, when I stopped by again, I couldn't help but notice how differently I felt walking through the door. It wasn't just my friend's house anymore. It was a place charged with possibility. And she was the reason. That evening, my friend was busy upstairs again, leaving the two of us in the living room. A film played softly on the television, though neither of us paid much attention. She was sitting on one end of the couch, her legs tucked gracefully beneath her, a blanket draped over her lap. I took the other end, trying to act natural, though the air felt heavier than usual, filled with all the unspoken words from before. We made small talk at first. She asked about my week, and I asked about hers. But our voices carried a kind of softness, as though both of us knew there was something waiting beneath the surface. At one point, a quiet lull settled over us. She shifted slightly, turning toward me, her hand resting on the cushion between us. I don't know if she realized it, if it was absent-minded or intentional, but my eyes fell on it, and for a long moment I debated whether to reach for it. The thought alone made my chest tighten. Before I could act, she moved first. Slowly, carefully, her hand slid across the small space and rested lightly on mine. It was such a simple gesture. No words, no explanation. Just her hand on mine. But the moment it happened, the entire room seemed to still. Her skin was soft, warm against my palm. I could feel the faint tremor of her fingers, the unsteadiness in the way she touched me, like someone stepping onto uncertain ground but choosing not to retreat. My heart hammered, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned my hand over and gently covered hers, letting my thumb graze the edge of her knuckles. She drew in a quiet breath. I glanced up at her, and her eyes were already on me. They weren't guarded or distant this time. They were open, searching, carrying all the unspoken truths she hadn't dared to voice. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That touch was its own confession, small, deliberate, but undeniable. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. The glow of the television flickered across her face, catching the delicate lines at the corners of her eyes, the curve of her lips as they parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I shouldn't." But her hand didn't move. She stayed there, holding on. I gave her hand the gentlest squeeze, letting her know without words that I wasn't going anywhere. And though nothing more happened that night, no embrace, no kiss, everything had changed. Because now, for the first time, we had crossed the line between what was accidental and what was intentional. After that night on the couch, nothing between us felt the same. We didn't speak of it, but the silence carried its own meaning. That single, deliberate touch lingered in my thoughts like an echo I couldn't silence. The next time I came by, I found myself wondering whether it would happen again, if she would look at me the way she had, if her hand would find mine. But instead of clarity, what I found was hesitation. She greeted me with the same warmth as always, but there was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of restraint, as though she was reminding herself of the boundaries that stood between us. I felt it too, that quiet pull of caution. After all, she was my friend's mother. She was older, established, respected. And I was, me. Just a younger man who'd stumbled into feelings that shouldn't have existed in the first place. We sat together in the kitchen while my friend was out running errands. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon from something she'd baked earlier, and the golden light of late afternoon spilled across the counter. She moved gracefully as always, pouring tea into 2 cups, but I noticed how carefully she avoided brushing against me this time. Even the space between us felt wider, deliberate. When she set the cup in front of me, her fingers brushed mine for the briefest moment, but she pulled back quickly, too quickly. Her composure faltered for a second, her eyes darting toward me before she looked away. That was when I realized she was fighting this just as much as I was. The air between us carried that silent struggle. She would laugh at something I said, but her smile would fade the moment our eyes locked too long. When I leaned forward, she leaned back. And yet, there were cracks in her resolve. A glance that lingered longer than it should. A pause in her words that betrayed unspoken thoughts. I wrestled with my own doubts. Was I crossing a line that should never be crossed? What would my friend think if he ever knew? What would people say if they saw us differently? The questions pressed heavily against me, but so did the memory of her hand in mine, the warmth of her presence, the way she made me feel seen in a way no one else had. Later, as we both reached for the same book she had set on the counter, our hands touched again, light, fleeting. This time neither of us moved right away. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide with conflict, and in that shared silence, everything we weren't saying screamed louder than words. Finally, she drew in a breath, steadying herself. "We should be careful," she said softly, almost as if to convince herself. I nodded, though my chest ached at the distance her words tried to create. But even as she pulled her hand back, even as she tried to restore the line between us, I knew we were already standing on the edge of something bigger than hesitation. It happened on a night when the house felt unusually still. My friend had left for the evening, and I stayed behind, helping tidy up after dinner. She moved gracefully around the kitchen, rinsing dishes while I dried them. The work was simple, ordinary, but the silence between us made every small motion feel charged. At one point, as she handed me a plate, our fingers touched and lingered just a second too long. We both froze. The plate was forgotten, balanced precariously between us. Our eyes met, hers wide, conflicted, almost searching mine for an answer she was afraid to voice. We finished the dishes quickly after that, each of us quieter than before. But when we moved into the living room, neither of us reached for the television remote. Instead, she sank into the couch with a soft sigh, and I sat a little closer than I normally would have. The lamp cast a warm glow over her face, highlighting the weariness in her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together, as though she were holding something back. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, almost suddenly, she did. You know. Her voice was soft, hesitant. I don't recognize myself these days. She gave a faint, nervous laugh, shaking her head. I've spent so many years just doing what I'm supposed to do. Taking care of everyone else. Forgetting myself in the process. I stayed quiet, letting her words breathe. Her eyes flickered toward me, then away again, as though it was difficult to hold my gaze. And then, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, you come along. And I find myself laughing at little things again. I catch myself looking forward to conversations, to company, to the way you notice things about me no one else seems to. And it scares me because… She paused, her breath catching. Because I haven't felt this alive in years, until you. The words hung in the room, fragile and raw. She pressed her hand against her chest as if to steady her heartbeat, then lowered her gaze, ashamed of what she had just admitted. For a moment, I didn't know how to move, how to breathe. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. But then instinct, or maybe something deeper, guided me. I leaned forward gently, sliding my hand over hers where it rested on her lap. Her fingers stiffened at first, then softened, curling lightly against mine. I tilted my head slightly, trying to catch her eyes. I feel it too, I said quietly, my voice lower than I intended, but steady. More than I can explain. Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, filled with both fear and relief. She didn't smile, not fully, but something in her expression eased, like a weight had lifted now that the truth was out. We sat there, our hands joined, our closeness unspoken but undeniable. There was no rush, no sudden leap forward. Just the warmth of her palm against mine, the soft rhythm of her breath, and the quiet understanding that nothing between us would ever be the same again. After that night, everything felt different, yet nothing about it was hurried. There was no sudden rush into something reckless, no dramatic confessions to anyone else. Instead, what grew between us was quiet and deliberate, a tenderness carried in the way we chose to be near each other. A few days later, I found myself in their home again. My friend had gone upstairs, leaving us in the living room. The air was calm, filled only with the soft tick of the clock on the wall. She sat on the couch, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful, as though the weight of our last conversation still lingered with her. I sat beside her, not too close, not too far, just enough for her to know I was there. For a while, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was something comforting in the shared silence, in the way our presence filled the space. Eventually, she turned her head and gave me a look that felt more intimate than words, steady, searching, a little vulnerable. Without asking, I reached out and let my hand brush gently against hers. She hesitated only for a second before letting her fingers slip between mine, the gesture simple but sure. Her hand felt smaller in mine, warm and steady. The contact wasn't dramatic, but it was profound. It said everything we hadn't needed to put into words, that despite the doubts and the weight of circumstance, we were choosing to be here, together, in this moment. She let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the cushions, and after a pause, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder. The warmth of her cheek pressed through the fabric of my shirt, and I could feel the soft rhythm of her breathing, slow, steady, calming. My heart, which had been restless for weeks, finally seemed to ease into a quieter beat. I tilted my head just slightly, close enough to catch the faint scent of her hair, subtle, familiar, comforting. The kind of detail that stays with you long after the moment ends. We sat like that for a long time. No confessions, no promises, no rush toward the future. Just the simple truth of closeness, of two people finding solace in each other's presence. At one point, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "This feels right." Her voice carried both relief and hesitation, as though she was still testing the weight of the words. I squeezed her hand gently, grounding her in the moment. "It does," I replied. "It doesn't have to be more complicated than this." And in that stillness, we found something rare, A peace that came not from what the world might think, but from what we knew in our hearts. We had stepped carefully, slowly, into something fragile yet real. The clock ticked on, the house remained quiet, and for the first time in weeks, there was no ache of uncertainty. Only warmth, closeness, and the quiet certainty that, whatever lay ahead, we had already chosen something worth holding on to.